Everybody, I'm back on YouTube. So let's all toast to the fact that apparently, I don't know if I'm assuming somebody manually reviewed my video in order to determine yesterday that the FBI warning you could go to prison if you fake a COVID vaccine card. I'm assuming they manually review before they boot your videos off, but perhaps it was an AI glitch. I don't know. The update is, as you can see, I'm obviously streaming right now, which means that I had my ability to get back into my channel restored, which was part of the problem last night with communicating this, because in addition to having that video removed, I got locked out with this word interstitial in the area that would normally show me like the videos and the analytics and all that kind of stuff. And I'm going to ask our esteemed guest today what that even means. But I will take this opportunity before we get started to just remind you that if you go to AllisonMorrow.locals.com or other links that are in the description, you will not lose the quality content that you're about to see, because they're not going to kick me off. And yesterday, I think, was a really good opportunity, even though I got my video restored after my appeal and I'm back on. It was as my parents used to say, it was an expensive lesson that I learned for cheap yesterday. And so just a reminder to everybody to go to those other platforms so that we don't have to worry about that stuff. Of course, I went back to another title for this video that could get me booted. So we'll see how long the stream lasts, but it is going to be simulcasted on ODYSEE. It'll be up on ROKFIN later, and StreamYard is always recording this, so that's good. And then, of course, Locals. It'll be uploaded on Locals, where I should say I am the most active. An easy place for you to pitch story ideas, to communicate with me, so definitely head over there. It's also the place where our guests are very active as well. vivabarneslaw.locals.com. Thank you, everyone, thank you guys for doing the stream on a Friday night. I know during COVID, we have extremely busy social calendars. And so Friday nights are really, during lockdowns, are really tight time. So I appreciate it. I wasn't really totally sure where we should start, other than the fact that I kind of left this stream generally speaking about the COVID lawbreakers, or the rule breakers, or whatever. I called it the COVID criminals. And I figured we could maybe do a round robin on some of the cases you all are paying attention to. I'm sure that the vast majority of the people watching right now know who you guys are, but would you like to introduce yourselves to those like 3 people watching who don't?
Is the audio working tonight? I see an F in the audio. Viva Frei?
You're fine. I hear you. Okay,
good. And I got distracted while you were talking because I was thinking of my first joke. I do live streams to get away from the kids now. My wife has not yet figured it out. It's been. I'm joking. Viva Frei, Montreal litigator turned YouTuber, living through mad times in Canada. Madder than the rest of you can imagine. Maybe just less mad than Australia. Let's prank so.
Nice. And Robert
Barnes. vivabarneslaw.locals.com. Always happy to be on and discussing the craziness of our current constitutional environment.
Nice. Okay, so why don't actually, you know what? I would like to start with the Canadian case, since you guys have been this pastor, right, that Viva, you've had on your channel. Well, you haven't had the pastor, but you've had his attorney, right, multiple times. Can you run us through that case briefly? Tell us what happened there, because it feels like I've heard even Michael Malice, I think, suggest that maybe it's time for the United States to invade Canada and free you guys. So maybe we should start with the worst case scenario. Like, what happened in Canada? I don't really quite understand how you guys went from these pacifist maple syrup producers to now a totalitarian dictatorship. Like, what happened there? And then let's talk about that pastor.
We've now moved into a world where I think people think, and I'm saying this without judgment, but I say it with judgment. People think that blindly following the rules is a virtuous thing, and challenging authority, questioning authority is a treasonous thing. It has gone full overboard in all of Canada. Different provinces have varying levels of the madness. Nova Scotia just recently, basically an injunction from the court prohibiting public protests against the masks and against the lockdowns, because the protesters were planning to protest apparently without masks. So they got an injunction to prohibit peaceable protest. Same thing in Alberta. Let's see. In the pastor's example, by way of example, there are now 3. There's Pastor Coates, who's coming out of Alberta. He was the guy, Grace Life Church, locked up in jail for 35 days, 2 weeks in solitary because of the COVID measures that they need to put people in solitary to make sure they're not contaminated. Incidentally, from what I understand, while they're also simultaneously releasing people from jail because of COVID. So, they find the room for the true lawbreakers, pastors. He was kept in jail for 35 days, ultimately released. He's going through his trial now. But then you also have that pastor, Artur Pawlowski, who is the activist pastor who was now arrested as well because he held services, shouted out the cops. And I mean, I don't know where you start, because I don't know how we got here and how we got here so quickly. To a point where people are literally saying all he has to do is follow the rules and we'll all be fine. Where you literally have people snitching on their neighbors, and you have the CBC, our Canada Broadcasting Corporation, talking about the joys and perils of snitching on your neighbors during a pandemic. It's gone overboard, and there's much less pushback here than there is in the States, from what I can see. So,
and you mentioned the protest issues, but Robert, we also had cases at the beginning of all of this too, where people were protesting, right? And I believe we had cases, at least one in North Carolina, where somebody was arrested for not socially distancing at a protest. So they may have not been able to shut down the idea, I guess, of a peaceful protest because we have the Constitution, or a peaceably assembling, whatever the exact wording is. But they were still arresting people there that they weren't protesting exactly the way that they were supposed to. So it still seemed like it was infringement in some way on that. What were your thoughts back when that was happening with the protest specifically?
Well, I was one of the first advocates against everything related to this, and even did a show briefly on AJ's network for a couple of months, just because I found this deeply disconcerting and disturbing trend that unfortunately a lot was predictable. Fortunately, Americans in the U.S., we have fewer Yankees. So, there's a lot of Yankees in Canada. And so there's a native what's interesting is the freedom lovers in Canada are generally French. It's more the French have had more of a rebellious streak than the Yankees up there. But it's like what would it be if Massachusetts ran America. That's what Canada kind of looks like. Mm-hmm. And so we've seen some of the ugliness of it. But we saw it throughout the states. I mean, probably one of the greatest political strategic mistakes they made was trying to impose on religion. That was probably a big, big error politically. And the first legal fight back that was really successful in the states was the churches. The churches pushing back, particularly against New York City, where it was absolutely crazy rules, in California, where, or I'd say California, where they've created certain rules. But, there wasn't enough judicial pushback. I mean, there were plenty of suits. I filed a bunch of suits. I took the most egregious cases to have them be politically sustainable. They always settled them. They always changed their policies and procedures intelligently. But a lot of other cases that should have won did not, or were delayed because in cases of public health emergency, there's a history, unfortunately, of governments getting away with a lot of craziness. It's just this craziness is a whole new level, because the degree to which this really is a public health emergency, to the degree to which they say is itself in serious doubt.
So what's the difference? Like, I brought up this was this California pastor in California whose attorney I had on the channel a while back. But if we were to stay on this topic specifically of religion and religious worship, and that being sort of, I don't know what the correct term would be, just like, I guess, in some cases, it depended on the state, right? What your state laws were, but nationally speaking, and compared to Canada, what are the differences between, like, okay, Viva, is it in Canada? Is it just, I don't know, is religion? I don't even know if religion is protected there by any kind of law document. So can we talk real fast about the differences there? Because it seems like in a lot of cases, we still ended up at the same, we ended up in the same place despite our legal documents and differences. So I'm just curious, like, what's the difference in Canada? But then also, Robert, in the United States, is it not really constitutionally protected? We just walk around thinking religion is constitutionally protected, but there are all kinds of ways that the government can get around that.
So, I mean, in Canada, take for granted, we have a different appreciation for it, but we have the exact same rights, with the exception of the Second Amendment, as you do in the States. We have a Canadian charter, a Canadian constitution. It guarantees basic rights: religion, mobility, search and seizure. It has effectively all of the same rights that are guaranteed in the American Constitution. It's a different format. It was a document that was created a little later in time, but it is a document that, by all accounts, is respected far less than the Constitution in the United States. The Constitution in the United States, and I've learned this through my vlog travels now, is itself, I would say, quasi-religious in the value that is placed on it. In Canada, we're subjects. So we have a constitution. Any right can be violated in accordance with, the rules of a free and democratic society. So it's a circular sort of tautological principle that you have your rights, but we can take any one of them away if it's necessary in a free and democratic society, which apparently when you have a virus with the known statistics that we have now, we no longer have any rights that are guaranteed. We don't have interprovincial travel. The border between Ontario and Quebec is still closed. People could not travel out of certain zones. If anyone saw my apocalyptic dystopian recording of our announcements, you can't travel from a red zone to an orange zone or a yellow zone, whatever they're doing. But basically, we have rights. We have constitutional rights. They just don't have as much weight. And we as Canadians are much more inclined, from what I can see and what I have seen, to defer to the authority of the government if we think that it is going to procure us a certain amount of security, even if it comes at the expense of our most fundamental liberties.
Yeah, I mean, in the States, the problem has been that freedom of religion is constitutionally protected explicitly and expressly in the First Amendment. However, the Supreme Court has limited its application. And so the Supreme Court said you can limit the freedom of a religion as long as you're not discriminating against churches, which I always found to be a nonsensical limitation. It's freedom of religion is freedom of religion. It's not freedom from discrimination against religion. It's freedom of religion, period. But even in that context, they couldn't help themselves. California and New York were still routinely discriminating against churches in their application of it. And it reflected, I think, an anti-religious bias of the statist left that has grown over the decades. And I think that's what is also, part and parcel of this. I debated this topic with William Kunstler years ago at Yale. And I was like, it's not just freedom of the state, of church and state separation, it's freedom of the church from the state. But unfortunately that concept is only partially recognized and enforceable. Ultimately, they were able to protect freedom of religion because so many of the provisions discriminated against it, but it should have been broader. It should have been bolder. Now, I brought a case where they had prohibited people from going to an Easter church service, sitting in their cars, listening to the service. And my idiot mayor, my hometown, Chattanooga, decided he had to ban that in the name of whatever. Somehow it was going to spread magically. You go to a church on Easter Sunday, and that COVID just is magical the way it attacks. Just like it always attacks small business instead of Walmart. Just like it will attack a freedom of religion protest, but it won't attack a BLM protest. It magically was going to come in on Easter Sunday. And I represented a young African-American mother who just wanted to take her kid to participate in the Easter egg roll and participate and sit in and listen to the service inside their own car. Now, I filed suit and he folded within like 3 days, being the kind of wuss that he naturally is. But that was the degree of it. I mean, this was the state testing its limits. How many of our rights could they restrict? How many of our liberties could they get us to forfeit without the ability of either the people or the courts pushing back? And unfortunately, they got much more success than they should have.
And I should highlight one distinction in the Canadian church cases versus the U.S., and it's a material one for anybody who wants to find a difference. The U.S. cases, Robert, we've gone over them a lot. They weren't asking to break the rules. They weren't asking for preferential treatment. They were asking for the same treatment that the big box retail stores were getting in terms of capacity, etc. They were being limited to like 10, regardless of the maximum occupancy of the institution. The difference in Canada, if someone wants to find one, Pastor Coates and Arthur Pavlovsky, they were not respecting the maximum occupancy, the social distancing, the plastic dividers. They were just holding services unfettered. And the argument, at least from Pastor Coates, was he is incapable of respecting these health ordinances because it's the way you have to conduct services. So there's that distinction. In Canada, they were breaking the rules and not abiding by them, whereas in the States, they just wanted to have equal application of the rules, which they didn't. They ultimately won. In Canada, we're going to see. But thus far, our courts have been notoriously even more deferential than even the lower courts that were overturned by the Supreme Court of the United States. On the one hand, federal court confirmed the constitutionality of these quarantine hotels, federal prisons that happen to be located in hotels, as far as I'm concerned. They sanctioned them in the positive sense. They approved of them on the basis that the risks of incoming travelers potentially testing positive for upwards of 14 days, they could not quarantine at home for those 14 days. They had to spend the first 3 in a government facility until they got a negative test. They confirmed that. They affirmed that. They said it's okay. It's justifiable under the circumstances. In Quebec, a provincial court confirmed the curfew. They said it was not unconstitutional because the plaintiff, who happened to be a lawyer as well, did not allege or did not suffer irreparable harm because all that he was required to do was not go out of his house after 8 o'clock until 5 in the morning. So there's a massive difference in how the courts apply things, if not at the lower levels, at the higher levels compared to the United States. And we've just basically deferred to anything the government says is necessary for safety. And people, far too many people seem to have accepted that, if not sooner than later. They've basically just abandoned any hope they had at the rights that they once owned. And they've deferred to the government as well.
Yeah, I think there are 2 lessons I've learned over this last year. It's number one, how subjective the courts really are, where just stupid me, I guess I just assumed that they were as objective as you could possibly get. And I think not just with what happened, what we saw like with Trump's presidency, but then also with COVID, it just, what do I know? I come from mainstream media, so I should have assumed that bias is everywhere, but I was living under a rock apparently. But the second thing that I learned that has become very glaring is the level of risk, just like you were saying, the government deciding what is safe or what is dangerous and what level of risk people should be able legally to take with their own lives. And of course, now I have a couple other cases I want to talk to you guys specifically about, guys, people that own the restaurants and the salon owners. But if we could switch gears for a second to the vaccination controversy over these cards, because now we've had this case of a guy at a bar allegedly was making the fake vaccination cards. And so the FBI now is warning people you could go to prison for 5 years if you're using a fake vaccination card. But my big question related to that has been, and I'll play this video in a second, has been, and maybe you guys can do a better job explaining it, and I've missed the explanation for this risk versus reward on this. If you trust the vaccine, if you think the vaccine is effective, which they clearly do because they keep telling us to get it, then why does it matter if I or somebody else, if somebody doesn't get it, isn't it their choice to take the risk that they're not getting the vaccine? Like, why would the vaccinated people care? I guess that's the big question. I just don't quite understand in that regard. Like, why if you choose to take the risk, if in fact that is one, if to not get it, where I think there are lots of people that are even debating that, but just say that you go on that line of thinking, why is the government deciding it's just too dangerous even for you to take that risk yourself? This is just very confusing to me. So not sure if you have any initial thoughts on that one.
I think Robert, you're gonna have some better knowledge on this in terms of the effects of the vaccine. The whole distinction as to whether or not it protects the individual from getting the virus or transmitting the virus, and if they get it, does it reduce the effects? But I think Robert has a better understanding of that than I do.
Yeah, I mean, well, throughout this entire thing, what's been really unusual is the complete absence of a cost-risk analysis, of a risk-reward analysis. Whether it's any of their public health intervention policies, they've never produced any evidence of this at all. And this was a key point in the case that did go through, the only case that has been tried, meaningfully tried, with evidence heard and a judge make a verdict, was by Judge Stickman in the Western District of Pennsylvania. And he pointed out they didn't have any evidence. They couldn't even meet rational basis review, the lowest possible basis of review that exists in the legal system. He was like, you don't even have a reason for these rules and restrictions because you don't have any data that supports it. And so this has been a recurrent problem throughout this context. But like the constitutional analysis, the ADA analysis under the Americans with Disabilities Act, share the same standards. I mean, there's arguments about what the constitutional standard is, but in my debate with Dershowitz, he mostly recognized that this should be the constitutional standard, and it corresponds to the ADA standard, which comes into play here because your perceived health status cannot be used as a predicate either to force a medical examination on you, to invade your privacy, or to limit your employment. And in this capacity, is there clear and convincing evidence of a substantial risk that you not taking the vaccine will cause severe harm to others? It can't be based on yourself. It's solely based on others. And that's where the belief, they haven't ever explained, this has been a problem in all of the vaccine debates, that they don't really make a compelling argument as to why it is the vaccinated need to fear the unvaccinated. What they'll generally say is they'll either use the variant argument. There could be a variant because this person gets it, and thus I won't be vaccinated from that. Or, which is more credible in the COVID context than it is in a lot of other vaccination debates. Or they argue that some people cannot get vaccinated because of their health condition, and they are now at risk. But if we looked at that from an evidentiary perspective, because there's other public health alternatives, I mean, if you know you have the virus, you can self-quarantine. The state can quarantine you if necessary, so on and so forth. By contrast, so we're only dealing with people who, by taking the vaccine, will spread it when they don't know they have it. Asymptomatic people, pre-symptomatic people. That's a very small time frame, usually 2 to 3 days. The number of people, the likelihood they spread it is extremely low. And the nature of COVID, from the data we have available to us, because the government has produced no cost risk benefit analysis on any of these, is that the chances that someone that's asymptomatic spreads it to someone who dies from it or suffers severe bodily harm is minuscule. I mean, it's less than 1%. It might be 1/100th of 1% when you look at the numbers. And it's like, so we're going to invade someone's privacy. We're going to violate the Nuremberg Code by experimenting on them with an experimental vaccine. And we're going to do so based on a complete absence of evidence where the only available data says that the risk is minuscule. This is not what's supposed to happen in the constitutional context.
And Allison, I think it's Janine Payton says, Allison asking the question I've been asking without getting a good answer. Well, first of all, I'm not sure that I'm not in a position to give the good answer. I only know the answer that they've been circulating in the media, which is, if someone is vaccinated, why do they need to insist on someone else being vaccinated if the vaccine is supposed to offer protection? The argument that I've heard is one of two, that you can still get it if you've been vaccinated. So to reduce those chances, everyone should get vaccinated, or leading into the second argument, in order to attain herd immunity, a certain percentage of the population either has to get the virus or get vaccinated. And so to get there, they need people to get vaccinated, and they are floating the idea of compulsory vaccination. Those are the two arguments. The people who are reluctant or don't want to take the vaccine say, if the vaccine is good, safe, and effective, if you've been vaccinated, you don't need to worry about me. Those are the two arguments, as I understand them, as to why anybody thinks everyone has to get vaccinated, and that is to double protect, because even someone who's been vaccinated can still get it with varying degrees of effect, even if they've been vaccinated. So to minimize that risk, everyone has to get vaccinated. As I understand it, if I'm wrong, someone in the chat can.
What it really reveals is their real objective is to condition Americans to accept mass vaccinations anytime they want. I mean, it's post 9/11. We conditioned a whole generation to accept invasions of privacy in the name of security, to where, I mean, people don't even remember anymore. You used to be able to walk into an airport normal. You didn't have to go through a body scan and all the rest of that nonsense to get on a plane to travel someplace. But we condition people to accept that in the name of security. I think this is not about the actual virus. I think this is about conditioning people to accept mass vaccinations whenever the government tells them. We got a drug. We want to stick it in you. It might be experimental, but be happy and do it. Otherwise, you want to kill grandma.
And just so nobody accuses Robert of being hyperbolic, when this is experimental, it is non-FDA approved emergency use vaccination. So experimental is potentially hyperbolic, but not incorrect in that this vaccine.
It's the medically correct terminology.
Yeah.
What the Nuremberg Code said was never supposed to happen again, not without informed consent.
Yeah, I was going to say, I believe that actually I'll look for it while we're watching this quick video, but I believe one of the I'm looking it up right now. One of the departments of health, the National Institutes of Health, is calling it an experimental coronavirus vaccine. I'll even show it to you in a second. But real fast, let's just take, since you brought up killing grandma, let's just take a look at Joe Biden real fast, shall we?
Get vaccinated or wear a mask until you do. It's vax ed or masked.
I'm Ron Burgundy.
Damn it! Who typed a question mark on the teleprompter? For the last time, anything you put on that prompter, Burgundy will read.
Okay, I had to play that because my husband gave me the idea of adding that since he said vax ed and masked. But anyway, if you haven't seen Anchorman, you definitely need to go check it out. Everybody in the chat, it is scary how true to form Anchorman is for especially national news.
I refuse to believe there's anyone in the world who hasn't seen Anchorman. I refuse to believe. But for anybody who doesn't appreciate what Joe Biden just did, he's reading off a teleprompter and they clearly bolded or put in caps the ED of the vaxxed so that he should emphasize get vaxxed or masked for phonetics. And he read vax ed because.
Because yes, do I need to play it again? Did we all hear it?
I thought you were going to say when he bought the domain name .com for the vax.com, which was, if I were, what's the word? Very eager, I would have jumped on that domain and purchased it for gags.
Well, they might have made a mistake by trying to play on the phonetics. They clearly are unaware that the most popular film that raises questions about vaccines in general is called Vaxxed. Because what they did is they encouraged a whole bunch of people to, Google vax and it won't show up on Google, show up on DuckDuckGo. And they'll see, I didn't even know that there was this movement out there. This, by the way, was the film that Robert De Niro was going to allow to be shown at his film festival in New York, Tribeca. And then he wussed out and removed it. It's a fascinating history. They also did a Vax 2. It's an intriguing set of histories, but it was educational 2 levels. That the only vaccine I would take is a vaccine that convinces me Joe Biden is not president. That's a vaccine I would take. But
I don't think you need that. Don't you already call him the fraudulency in chief?
His fraudulency the second.
Oh,
his fraudulency the first is Rutherford B. Hayes. His fraudulency the second. He's not worthy of being the first of anything.
Okay, well, so 2 quick questions. So Tyrone is asking, how can a synthetic experimental injection create herd immunity? I know we're not all doctors, but I didn't know if somebody had a response to that. I mean, I guess when it comes to discussing it, I think just to go back to something that you said, Robert, is that I would just like there to be more fair and open discussion about all of this. Like you said, the cost benefit analysis, mainstream news is doing 0 of that. They're just pushing the vaccine and acting like there are no scientists or doctors who are pushing back on that, which is totally false, to make it sound like it's just, Jim Bob somewhere in the middle of the woods who doesn't want to get it versus science is just factually inaccurate. And I think that's where, to me, I get concerned about it all, because I saw a guy tweet not too long ago that here's how you can tell if somebody didn't get the vaccine. They have a MAGA sticker on their car. They voted for Trump. They asked to talk to the manager, and it just basically listed like all of these very stereotypical right-wing ways of being, as if those are the only people that are talking about this. And I think that's just a real travesty for this discussion, because not only do I think it drives more skepticism among people, like they keep thinking that if they put more and more videos out where they're suppressing the comment section, you see these videos on YouTube, the like to dislike ratio is, I've never seen anything like it. You're like 50 likes and 8,000 dislikes. And then they think that these videos are doing something to change people's minds instead of having fair conversations about it. And I think it's doing exactly the opposite.
Because my argument is there's 2 major problems procedurally with the COVID-19 vaccine that has raised questions and doubts in the public's mind. And one is the complete suppression of debate and dialogue and discussion about it. I don't trust any outcome of any thought process that says you can't debate it, you can't discuss it, you can't have dialogue about it. You must suppress and censor all forms of dissent. I'll give an example. Richard Barris, People's Pundit Daily, did a poll just polling different people's opinions about it. And what it was is within the African-American community especially, there was skepticism. And he started talking about why they were skeptical, and YouTube immediately stopped and took down his live broadcast. So, I mean, that's a sign. I don't trust somebody that is scared to have a public debate about this. And as Brett Weinstein has pointed out, as a true scientist, he goes, that's a problematic sign from the get-go. That's a sign. You want robust debate so that people that can have confidence in the decision that's been made. The lack of debate should sow doubt and skepticism. The second aspect is the complete absence of any skin in the game. When you go in and you start off by saying, we're going to do this experimental vaccine, we're going to do it using mRNA technology, we're going to do it with first ever mass vaccine that has that, we're going to do so without clinical trials, we're going to have an emergency use authorized, and we're going to do so, but by the way, there's going to be no skin in the game. Everybody's immune. Anybody, if there was any mistake, if it turns out we were lying to you, your problem. Because you can't sue anybody. And most importantly, they remove the power of the jury. In America, we let juries decide justice, decide fairness, decide efficacy, decide what the facts are, decide what the truth is. They don't want juries to get anywhere near evaluating this. So they won't let us publicly debate it, and they won't let juries get near it. That's a sign of something wrong, not a sign of something strong.
And I'll add this one, Robert, on Allison, on CJAD, which is our daytime radio, which has been running not just hardcover, but like outright cheerleading for the government, which causes me to question, motivations, but that doesn't matter. Their debate today, the discussion today was, how do you advise people to go get the vaccine? And they're talking about, gift cards, lotteries, etc. And at one point I said, is the question no longer like, do you have to get it? Or is the question now, how do you get the people who want to get it? How do you get the people who are reluctant to get it, convince them to get it? And talking about the absence of debate, it's when you have conflicting messages coming out of the very government that relates specifically to safety issues. Justin Trudeau, the prime minister, when asked which vaccine is the right one for people, and he came out and said, the right vaccine for you is the first one that you have access to. And then I think it was 24 hours later, if not the same day, when Johnson & Johnson, AstraZeneca had their issues, then it's something that, whoa, we're suspending this to 40-year-old women. But barely a day ago, we were saying you take the first one you're given. And in Quebec, I knew someone who said, like, they gave me the vaccine the morning of the day they made that announcement, when they knew it, and they gave it to me without letting me know. That afternoon, they make the announcement, and I'm like, well, I might not have taken that vaccine had I known what you knew, but did not disclose the morning of. And then they dare treat everybody who has a question or a reluctance. They treat them like Jenny McCarthy's, who are doubting, like the efficiency of a tetanus vaccine. It's pure politicizing a very intimate decision with very legitimate, serious health concerns, because of what the news actually is before it gets spun and suppressed. But the prime minister says you take the first vaccine you get. A day later, unless you're 40, unless it's that vaccine, which causes people to have questions.
To Bob
ahead.
Wildfish's question, yes,
Yeah.
There's supposed to be no therapeutic available in order to authorize any vaccine as emergency use.
Okay. Thank you for answering that. Back to what you were discussing. So do you remember that video of the ER doctor that was on, I believe it was Cuomo's show, and she was saying, if we wait until everything's opened up, then we won't have this carrot to dangle in front of people anymore, and they won't get vaccinated. So it's really important that we push vaccination before freedom returns, because then people will be like, well, why am I going to do it? And it reminded me of I actually was talking to my dad about this, he's an orthopedic surgeon, but he works at the veterans, the VA hospital, and he is sometimes assigned to the vaccine clinic. And so every time he has a patient, he says, do you have any questions or concerns about the shot? And he said, almost every single person has said, no questions. I just want to get this over with so that I can have my life go back to normal. And my dad will say, okay, how will this help your life get back to normal? Well, I just want to be able to go to the gym again. I just want to, and then they just list all of these things that they can't do until they get the vaccine. And so he said he really hasn't ever had one person say, well, I'm just nervous that I'm going to die of COVID, so I'm getting the vaccine. Every single one of them says to him, I just want to be able to go to the gym again, which seems a very odd reason for everybody to be to be participating in a particular health initiative, right? Like you would think people would say, I think this is good for my health, so that's why I'm doing it, not because I want to go back to movie theaters. And so I just find that odd. And just another thing to bring up, since you were talking about like lack of debate and whatnot. So this is an opinion piece in the New York Times, and they literally said, since your friend doesn't want the vaccine, what do you say? And it's fascinating. They literally walk you through text message options. So you can, so your friend says, so you can select your reply. Wait, are you an anti-vaxxer? And then they say, not a good choice. This response tells them their concerns are irrational and overblown. So they're like, it's like going to, some kind of, like propaganda conference or something where you're like, well, what if this is what I want to say? And they go, no, this would be a better way to get people to think about it. So it's everywhere. And like I said, this stuff, I don't think, like, even if I were to just play devil's advocate for a second and totally agree with the New York Times on all of this, I still think it's doing exactly the opposite of what they think it's doing.
First of all, get that doctor who was on CNN or whatever. If it changes anything, the same one who's trying to determine how to tie the vaccine to policy is a Washington Post contributor. And politics ruins everything. You want to know how you get people suspicious? You have doctors working in tandem with mainstream media to coordinate medicine with policy. You're going to have people raise some concerns. And when you have Jimmy Kimmels of the evening getting doctors swearing in your face saying you're an effing idiot if you don't want to get the vaccine, you're dumb, I'm smart, listen to what I have to say. That's also how you create vaccine hesitancy. Everything they're doing is creating the hesitancy. And it's almost, to get conspiratorial, it's almost as though it's what they want to do. When you start bribing people into getting a vaccine and shaming people and conditioning their basic rights on getting a medical treatment that is relatively new, they might not need, they might not want, people start to ask questions, and it's the entire wrong way of going about it. But when you find out that these doctors who are supposed to be giving you independent medical advice are also contributors to the mainstream media outlets that have been known to have slight biases, that's a big problem.
Well, and in my view, I was accused of conspiracy theories very early on because I started talking about this in March of 2020. I even got Trump to retweet me because I was begging Trump not to go crazy. And I said that I'd build a statue to him in my front yard if he would put an end to this nonsense. And he was temporarily on board. And then they came to him with the fear tactics, Fauci and Birx, and said, you're going to be responsible for 2 million grandmas dying unless you go along with our agenda. And what I was saying back then is they're going to use this as a pretext to see how much they can, as a real live Milgram experiment, to see how much they can suppress, censor, and control people and give themselves all new rights they've never had before, to the extent of not even going through legislative bodies to do so. And that if you believed in a Bill Gates type theory, that what I predicted back in March is I said, if Gates is pushing a certain agenda here, then his goal will be to get people's lives so miserable that they will beg for vaccines. And here we are a year later, and that's precisely what's happening. I mean, think about it. We're to a point where the mainstream media promotes Bill Gates as a doctor. He's not a doctor. The only other person with a doctorate he was close with is named Jeffrey Epstein. By the way, he didn't kill himself. More evidence of that today. Eternal truth number 2. But it's amazing how much people are saying we live in an Alex Jones world. You go back to February, March 2020. The guy predicting all of this was him. And at some point, you have to say there must be something there that's going on that they don't want to talk about or discuss, because it's amazing how predictable it's become. The reason most people are going to take the vaccine. This was about getting people conditioned to accept the idea of mass vaccinations on a continuous basis, without questions, without criticism, and to completely quash what they call the anti-vax movement, which is mostly an informed consent movement.
And incidentally, this was something a distinct memory I have. It was March or April 2020. Cernovich, this was on his Twitter feed at one point when the mask was the big ask. And you see there, I did it without making a Biden slip. When the mask was the big ask, wear your masks outside because it's not a law. We're not going to make it a law. Just do it. And I remember Cernovich tweeted a video of himself with the mask on. He says, look, people are freaking out. Just wear the mask. Quit being annoying. Wear the mask. And I remember, and I'm not pooping on Cernovich at all, because I still think he's probably right. But I remember one person in response to his tweet took his exact words, but added the word vax. Just shut up and take the vax. People are freaking out. Just take the vax. And at the time, I thought it was such an over exaggerated, hyperbolic fear. And we are now literally a year later where Bloomberg is putting out opinion pieces. It might be time for forced vaccinations. And we're in
thank you for
Quebec
bringing that up.
talking about vaccine passports. Trudeau, our own wonderful PM, stick around for my vlog afterwards. Trudeau's corrupt, but that's another thing. He's saying we're not going to, we won't go with forced vaccinations. He didn't say this, but we might predicate, certain services, better services on proof of vaccination. That this should even be the discourse, not in general, but for a specific virus with 99 point whatever percent survival rate. We know who's at risk. We know who's not at risk. That this should be the discussion, predicating your most fundamental civil rights and liberties on effect. It's compelled vaccination. It's inconceivable that we've gotten here. It was inconceivable a year ago, and we've gotten here fast.
Oh, I remember when my friend in Portland told me about parks getting closed down, and I go, they'll never do that here. I didn't even think they were going to close down parks. That's how ignorant I was about where we were going. I'd never close down the parks.
They locked a dog run they put a padlock on the dog run in March 2020 April because I mean it's comical science fiction, absurd reactions, and there's no logic anywhere in this, but people were so terrified and still are. They'll do anything. And right now, this is the big ask.
Besides the logic side of it, there's the precedent side of it, which I don't hear many people who are on the pro side discussing, like what kind of precedent you're setting here. Maybe the precedent's already been set, and we just assume that this is just something that the government does for our safety. Patriot Act. Maybe that's what people believe then. And so now we're just kind of back in the same situation. This was the Bloomberg article that you were referencing. What happens when vaccine incentives aren't enough? Reluctant citizens can slow down herd immunity despite abundant vaccines. Compulsory shots are unpalatable, but may be necessary. And it's funny because just a few weeks ago, Peter Hotez, this famous vaccine scientist, he's always on the news. He's been on Rogan before, won't debate who he calls anti-vaxxers because he says it would give legitimacy to their arguments. Because I remember that was something that Rogan asked him, well, why don't you just debate him? And he's like, oh, I wouldn't do that. That would legitimize their arguments. But he said in his article in Nature that he would like terrorism experts to now be on a panel to I think he actually called it an offensive, to go after the vaccine dissent group related to the COVID vaccines as if they're cyber terrorists. And it's just, and so I was like, gosh, that was just an article in Nature, but this guy's got a lot of influence. And now, like you said, now it's in Bloomberg. It's a totally normal thing in mainstream news now to even be talking about. And maybe, Robert, related to what, we kind of skipped over the Biden thing where he's saying, hey, get vaxxed or masked. Could that really happen? I mean, is that really something where it's like we could submit for, say, 25 years? Because then that brings us to the next topic, which is these cards, which, of course, I mean, any thinking person realized that fake cards were going to eventually come out if there were going to be requirements to work. I see people sometimes saying, well, the government's not forcing you to get vaccinated yet. But, there are compulsory ways that people are being boxed in now. If it's a decision between you're going to feed your family and you want to have your personal choice over your health and you want to feed your family and your job is requiring this or whatever else, it wasn't shocking to me to see that black market vaccine cards were coming out. But I guess maybe we could just start with this idea of you have to do this. Like when Biden said that, is that just, was that, it didn't look like obviously he was speaking off the cuff because he made the prompter mistake. So that's something that they wanted him to say. That was pre-planned. Is that allowed? Is that legal?
Not in my view. I mean, the question is whether the courts will actually meaningfully enforce it. So there's only two cases that deal with mandatory vaccines, one in the public school context in the early 1980s. The other one, the foundation for this entire doctrine was called the Jacobson case in 1905. And all it said was if you have a very safe and effective vaccine that is treating a very lethal disease, that a person poses a real risk of transmitting it without getting the vaccine, then you can issue a small fine against him or you can exclude him from a city. That was all they said. Now, that decision was used as the foundation for the eugenics case, Connie Buck. It was the only decision for it. And those two decisions which was forced sterilization. And then those two decisions were used as the foundation for the Korematsu decision. That's why I call it the trilogy of infamy. In my view, it was a morally horrendous decision that was issued. Constitutionally offensive, but morally horrendous, because I don't believe the government ever has that right or capacity outside of very, very limited circumstances. But in this and I don't think they've anywhere near their evidentiary burden. But right now, like, to the degree they could require masks, so far they've limited to federal property and things like that. But they've tried to extend that to say wherever the federal government is spending money, maybe we can mandate masks. They're getting blowback in other contexts outside of masks where they've tried to leverage state policy on this tax context, the racial discrimination, gender discrimination they were using COVID relief. They're getting judicial pushback there. In my view, no. But the reality right now is that the courts, the underlying issue is you have a class divide in America between the professional class and the working class. And the professional class believes they should have control of every aspect of society. And they share values, and they credential and acculturate together in educational institutions. And they dominate the media, they dominate the political class, they dominate the doctors and medical profession, and they dominate the judiciary by definition. And the problem is you're seeing incredible deference to whatever their fellow conspiracy of the white lab coats and the black robes. And those two people get together, horrible things happen. And that's what I think is that's the real risk, is a political risk. Constitutionally, I don't think they've met anywhere near the evidentiary burden for this. But I believe that they're trying to set both a societal precedent and a legal precedent to be able to do this routinely. Does anybody really think this is going to be a one-off, that they're not going to come back to this again and again and again and again? That no way. And the variance could be the current excuse, or it could be other viruses in the future, because fear is always the basis to take away people's rights and liberties. And this has achieved far more success than even war or crime ever could.
And I just want to highlight that thing, the article by Clara Ferreira Marquez in Bloomberg. You have someone who is pushing with the guise of authority. It may be necessary just to pin you down, and like Dershowitz said, pin you down and jab at you. This person thinks that she has the authority to actually promote this idea with authority. Just her bio, from what I can read, a Bloomberg opinion column is covering commodities and environmental, social, and governance issues. Who the heck does she or anyone in the media think they are to come out with mainstream media articles saying it might be necessary for us to administer a medicine against your will to achieve herd immunity in a virus that has, now we know what the fatality rate of it is, and we know who is affected by that. Imagine the audacity and the arrogance it takes to actually come out with that position. And this is in the context of this virus, with its, relatively speaking, infinitesimal or very low risk of death. Yeah, this was the precedent that was being set, and they succeeded beyond their wildest dreams in the context of something that, was 5 times deadlier than the flu. When there's a next one, it is there's going to be no bar too low or too high to breach. They've set one heck of a precedent, and people have gone along with it willingly.
And the amazing thing is the media's complete suppression of contrary histories, because there's only one American experience of doing this. 1976, swine flu. We rushed a vaccine out there. Several years later, it turned out the vaccine was far, far, far more dangerous than the swine flu presented. CBS 60 Minutes did a piece on it. In fact, like, YouTube will keep taking down the 60 Minutes broadcast, and other people just keep re-uploading it so that people can still find it. And there has not been a single mention of that in the mainstream media's coverage of this. Oh, you know what? We've only actually tried this one time before, where we rushed an experimental vaccine for an influenza-type virus, and it totally failed and backfired.
Yeah, the lack of just reminding people or even just including that it's experimental, it does seem purposely suppressed, especially if you see, like, I brought this up because we were talking about it earlier too. But so this is the National Institutes of Health, January 12th, 2021. I mean, they're saying it's highly effective, but they're still calling it an experimental coronavirus vaccine. So it's not like that's something that you should be labeled a conspiracy theorist, though people like Ryan Christian of The Last American Vagabond, now on probably his 20th Twitter handle called Ignatius Riley, because he's been kicked off so many times for sharing stuff like that. And so I do think in part that's one of the reasons that we have such a hard time having conversations about this topic is because, not that I really do think people are responsible for their level of education to a large degree. It's like, if you're not seeking it out, then, come on, like, we all need to do our part to figure out what's going on. But that said, I do have some sympathy for the average American or Canadian or whoever else who's just sitting at home being bombarded constantly by these talking points and really given no, or at least not the level of complexity that this conversation deserves. And you have to go on new media to find it. But even on new media, it's really hard because, like yesterday, I just did a video about the FBI warning people that, these fake vaccine cards could land you in prison. And even though I was just quoting my old newsroom in their story, which is up, they have their video on YouTube and it's doing totally fine. And then just giving people some background on how editorial decisions are made and how law enforcement talking points end up on the news without a whole lot of critical thinking. My video was ripped for medical misinformation. I was locked out of my account and I appealed, and here I am, I'm back on. But people are inculcated with these messages constantly that it's so simple. It's like, it's just do your part. I had a journalist friend of mine say that to me a bunch of times. Like, it's just doing your part. And when you push back and you're like, but what does that even mean? Like, what does do your part even mean? It becomes very clear. They're not really quite sure, but part of the problem is that they have this extremely elevated sense of moral crusader to them. And so if you give one of these journalists the opportunity to think that their reporting and their behavior, make them God's gift to American democracy, then God help you, you won't even get their heads through the door. So it's been sort of this combination that's been, I think, extra lethal to the intellect, especially in newsrooms, because it pairs their egos and their moral crusading into this behavioral experiment. In which case, because they have this bias already, they're already sensitive to thinking that anything outside of it is nuts. And that, so they're not going to share that with you, because they also believe nowadays that sharing harmful information that they consider harmful, and they don't even know better, that it may be legitimate information, but that they need to block that from you. That's definitely, I would say that's a general practice in newsrooms nowadays. The idea that, that we just shouldn't be putting false information out there. And like I've said before, may sound like a great talking point, shouldn't put false propaganda out there, but the average journalist is just not qualified to distinguish between what's harmful and what's fact. They just don't know what they're talking about.
And it's a lack of belief in method. In other words, like the what we're taught as lawyers is to have confidence in a certain method to determine truth, a certain process to get to justice. And that process and method, like in the scientific method or the method in an adversarial trial process, is you let both sides speak. You let both sides present evidence that fits certain standards, and you let an impartial jury make a decision. We should have that same process for public debate and public dialogue about anything. It's why we protect freedom of speech. It's not just my right to speak. It's the right of the audience or my right to hear someone else speak. And the fact that we've completely abandoned that method of getting to truth has almost always been a problematic sign. It is sooner or later, that method will lead to a bad outcome by everybody's definition. And that's why it's more risky. And it's sad that journalism in the mainstream establishment media has abandoned the idea of ascertaining truth by attending to objective facts and listening to differing opinions and voicing them for the public to decide. And it shifted to a new priestly class that believes its job and duty is to tell you what to think, not just to tell you here's what other people think and you decide.
Alison, this is going to illustrate the hilarity, the absurdity of what you just described. Just on Twitter last night, I made a joke because now Ontario, at one point they said, we're having a wave of hospitalizations, a wave of ICU. We need to shut down everything to the point of house arrest, where the police were empowered to stop you on the street, ask you where you're going, and if you didn't have a good excuse, ticket you and send you home. So I said to a couple of doctors, one was from the Ontario Hospital Association, where they tweeted, Given the wave of hospitalizations, we need to shut down now. It's our only choice. And I said, and I tweeted them a graph from the government website, flat line of the ICUs, but because it was on a very big scale, like it was in the hundreds, so you didn't really see much of anything. And I said, where do you see the wave of hospitalizations? I just said, where do you see the wave of hospitalizations? Instant blocked from this particular doctor. Then I got blocked by two other doctors. And so yesterday I said, this is, and by the way, now we're on the tail side of any wave, and they'll take credit for it, having been stifled by house arrest, but it probably wasn't because it's down everywhere else too. I said, hey guys, look, I was blocked by 3 doctors for questioning the wave. This was a month ago. Look where we're at now. And then some, call maybe a troll, I don't know, maybe he's sincere, says, you were blocked by 3 doctors and you think they're the problem? As if to say stifling the discussion is a sign of winning the debate. And I responded, I said, yes, they're the problem, because if you're confident in your position, you don't block someone from challenging it. You engage in that discourse and you let the person express themselves. We've to the point where if people read it in the New York Times, and they read in the New York Times, or they hear their favorite politician say, if you're anti-mask, you're an extreme right-wing selfish bastard, you demonize any contrary thought to the point where you don't have to address it. And people still place value in Bloomberg, in New York Times, despite the fact that they are fake news by definition. And they do it so they can feel smart, feel morally superior, and feel intellectually superior by demonizing and degrading anybody who thinks differently. It's a phenomenal trend. I feel bad for anybody who actually relies on and has faith in the authority of these washed up fake news media outlets.
To the
go ahead.
One question briefly about the yes, if an employer mandates the vaccine, the CDC is recognized. It was either CDC or EEOC recognized that yes, they are liable for any injury the person suffers. Which I've been telling people. I drafted a I didn't draft it. It came to me in a bottle, which was a letter that people could send to their employer or their educational institution or any other governmental or any other authority that tries to compel a vaccine as to why it's illegal. No copyright asserted. They can go to vivabarneslaw.locals.com. But it's right there. You copy it, paste it, do what you want. Not legal advice. The bar tells me I can't do anything like that, and I would never do that. So it's whatever you find folks decide to do with it. But one of the provisions of it, I think a lot of employers would think long and hard about, particularly your small, medium-sized employer, long and hard before they require a vaccine if they knew that, unlike the drug manufacturer, they're not immune and are on the hook for anything that goes wrong. And for people that don't, this is what Eric Weinstein has been hammering away. Dark Horse podcast, great guy. Left. He's been a former client. Is that he says, look, the risk with this vaccine is going to be long-term. It's not likely to be short-term. And we should be honest with everybody and say, we don't know what those risks are.
Right.
We don't have any idea what those risks are. It may turn out to be nothing, but there's been little flashes here and there of such risks. And so, and given that it's an experimental method of vaccine for a infection, for a coronavirus, when we've never had a consistently long-term successful coronavirus vaccine in history. So there's all kinds of big questions about this that unfortunately are being suppressed by our new priestly class of guardians. And
Robert, you reminded me of what I wanted to say when I called in the radio to say, you guys are talking about incentives, how to get people to take the vaccine to be less hesitant. So you want to know the main one? Eliminate immunity for these pharmaceutical companies that have produced the vaccine, because they are immune from any consequences specifically for this vaccine. One person tweets back, well, that'll just kill manufacturing. To which someone else responded, no, it doesn't. It hasn't killed manufacturing for Viagra, for any of these other drugs. If you want to instill confidence in people you are asking to administer a drug, and if it's so safe and effective, eliminate the immunity from the pharmaceutical companies that are producing it. Very simple.
So I bring up this super chat because specifically I want to talk about the fact checkers too, and how they change their minds all the time and get things wrong. So Bob's saying, I think you got taken out because you mentioned flu in the same video as vitamin D. That's a no-no. But actually what YouTube told me was that that they do not allow anything related to the COVID vaccines that goes against authoritative sources like the WHO. That's specifically what they wrote. But what was interesting about that statement is that the WHO even has changed, its guidelines over time, where if you had said something earlier, like you were ahead of them, you were considered against what they were saying, but then they would catch on 3 months later. And then it's like, now it's allowed to be said, as if they like have never made any mistakes before. And that was always my problem with this particular virus and the way it was handled with the tech companies and what you're allowed to say is that, like, for instance, I've had Dr. David Brownstein on the channel. He's an MD in Michigan who has been treating a lot of coronavirus patients. And so he was interviewing his patients, talking about the treatments that they were giving. None of them died. And he just thought that it would be seen as valuable because it's like this new virus. And, nobody really knew what to do to treat it originally we're putting people on ventilators, which then, if you went against ventilators, that was considered misinformation. Then find out that the ventilators were hurting people. And the FTC came after him. It wasn't even the tech companies. The government literally came after him and said, cease and desist. You can't even, on your own website, you can't even say, hey, this is what my patients experienced. This is what we did with them. Try it if you want. Like, you can't even do that, which is, it's sad because it's like a novel virus at the beginning of it. People like, if I'm of the ilk that, hey, if I want to survive and this is the treatment I choose, like I would like to have access to it, especially if it's on the guy's own website. It's not even like he's using one of these social media platforms or whatever. So it's a whole nother level too with the government, and it's pressure on the silencing these conversations. But then, you see this just came out with Town Hall, and it's like PolitiFact backtracks fact check over COVID-19 lab leak hypothesis. And so if you click this, it should take us to, so it's like archive. This is where it is now. Archive fact check, editor's note. When this fact check was first published in September 2020, PolitiFact sources included researchers who asserted the virus SARS-CoV-2 virus could not have been manipulated. That assertion is now more widely disputed. For that reason, we are removing this fact check from our database pending a more thorough review. So it's just, but people often don't see this. First off, they never see the like little editorial at the bottom where it's like, editor's note, we made a big mistake. And so it's just like, you can't even necessarily trust the fact checkers. Why do people do that? I have journalists send it to me all the time, like, but PolitiFact says this, and you're like, yeah, but come on. I mean, why do we put such trust in these groups that clearly have, well, either they're wholly ignorant of how some of this stuff works, or they do have an agenda.
Well, I mean, WHO was compromised from the get-go because of their relationship with China. Almost the number one contributor to the World Health Organization worldwide is Bill Gates. A lot of PolitiFact and a lot of the other fact-checking organizations, partially funded by Bill Gates and the Gates Foundation. I mean, Politico back in 2017, the Europe version actually had a bunch of whistleblowers come forward and say there's a real problem at how much influence Bill Gates has, and he's buying off public health officials all around the world. And what's happened is the fact checkers have become politically compromised. I mean, Viva does a lot of videos just where they fail the basic test of checking actual facts, but they're just political propagandists. I mean, that was an aggressive post that they made. Tucker Carlson puts on debunk conspiracy theorists. When in fact he'd never been debunked, and the people doing the debunking were people that had connections to the Wuhan Institute of Virology. People like Fauci, who had connections to the Wuhan Institute of Virology. People like Bill Gates, who had connections in a range of ways to activities there. And it was it's because it's become, and it's what happens when you say, I'm no longer going to employ a particular method of discussion or debate or coming to a conclusion about something. I'm going to go out and lecture people on the right opinion. The news has shifted from information to propaganda. And that's what I tell my journalistic friends. My niece wants to get into journalism. She would just be a propagandist, frankly. She believes every lefty conventional thought known to man. It drives her nuts because I'll occasionally, I could sit there and predict all of her opinions. If I give her my opinions, she'll get half of them wrong. And it shouldn't be, and drives her a little crazy because her opinion shouldn't be that predictable.
Did she watch you on YouTube? Like, would she be watching this? I hope she's not going to see.
No, she's not. She's not.
Okay.
Because that's just it. She doesn't really watch, read, or review any independent information. She, lives in New York City, is going to go to, got a scholarship to one of the big schools of journalism, I think NYU, to do long form writing, and has, very smart, very bright, very conscientious kid, but has grown up in such an embubbled environment. She doesn't even know what the other opinions are because the new culture, the new safe space culture that's taken over the priestly professional class says those are dangerous, bad things to be around.
Yeah.
Everybody has to appreciate how dangerous that particular PolitiFact first of all, it's politifake. It's garbage. Snopes is for dopes. It's garbage. But everybody has to appreciate how dangerous that is, because a year ago, that PolitiFact fact check was used to take down channels, take down videos that, hey, a year ago, it could have saved lives. A year ago, hypothetically, useful information and useful action could have come from this actual information, instead of it being stifled for political, cultural, racist reasons. People were silenced over that fact check. And whether or not this one was as overt as that the guy who was shot in the back when he was going to his car with a knife, what was his name? Jacob
Blake.
Jacob Blake. You know, when they fact check Jacob Blake and say he didn't have a knife in his hand, he had something in his hand, and a knife was found in his car, but it could have been sunglasses in his hand. When in an interview he says I had a knife. When they do fact checks like that, you know, the collateral damage of the fake news fact check is limited. In this, it stifled discussion that was a global interest a year ago. They took down videos, took down channels. It was a no-no on YouTube as a platform. And oops, quiet as the night. Brian Sicknick didn't get hit in the head with a fire extinguisher. Dead of the night. Yes, it started. There's evidence that it originated in a Wuhan chemical lab, whatever. It's dangerous. It's dangerous to the point where people need to be not just turned off, but they need to be shocked and appalled by it.
Yeah.
The other irony with all this from a journalistic perspective is they hate people like Alex Jones. But this is why Alex Jones continues to grow.
Right.
It's what they are doing.
Mhm.
Because, I mean, Jones was saying this was true almost out of the gate. And that's because he has one of the biggest biosafety lawyer whistleblowers in the country that he gives free access to, that the institutional media suppresses. Even though this guy's a law professor at the University of Illinois, Francis Boyle, the mainstream press won't cover him. And the institutional media lied to him. And it's the constant lying of the institute, the constant gaslighting of the institutional press that is driving ordinary Americans out of that abusive relationship into the welcome arms of independent media, that they then sit around and bemoan and say, why do people watch and listen to him? It's because of them.
I have two last topics that I wanted to talk to you guys about before we wrap, but I wanted to read a quick excerpt from Manufacturing Consent, which my daughter ripped the part of the cover off of, because I believe, if you remember, when I was on your Wednesday sidebar, I got skewered in the comments for suggesting that journalists don't always understand or have the self-awareness that they're pushing this propaganda, or that they even are wrong, that they don't even know what they don't know. So I'm just going to read you 3 sentences real fast, okay? From Noam Chomsky's book. The elite domination of the media and marginalization of dissidents that results from the operation of these filters occurs so naturally that the media news people, frequently operating with complete integrity and goodwill, are able to convince themselves that they choose and interpret the news objectively and on the basis of professional news values. Within the limits of the filter constraints, they often are objective. The constraints are so powerful and are built into the system in such a fundamental way, the alternative basis of news choices are hardly imaginable. So I don't know what you think about that. I just figured I'd bring it up for you to push back on if you don't agree, but I would just like to say that I'm not alone in thinking that a lot of these people are actually brainwashed by their own propaganda, and that they just spew it out completely unaware.
Well, I'll give you credit for one thing, Allison and Robert. We say this hashtag confession through projection. It's nice that you assume the innocence of the journalists around you, because it sort of presupposes your own innocence. I don't share that view.
Well, I mean, my view is that's been my view about a wide range of things. I call it the power of acculturation. Like the way the old Southern culture used to create an elite that was recognizing its own self-interest against the interest of the broader population, from which Amy Coney Barrett derives, by the way, a little side point. But is through the Cotton Ball. You go to a Cotton Ball when you're 17, sort of introduced to a certain different society, and you recognize, oh, I'm different than everyone else. I have my own interest opposed to everyone else. And it's what public education really is all about. It's about acculturation, not about training the mind. And so if you acculturate people effectively, you don't need to brainwash them every day. The self-censorship is more powerful than external censorship. And if you get people believing what they're doing is right and righteous, that's what leads to some of the most evil regimes in the world. I mean, that's how you get communists acting in a certain alignment in state officials. That's how you get the rise of the Nazis in part. That's how you get all Islamic fundamentalism in part. That's how you get any sort of dangerous ideology, is that you have a bunch of people who don't question. I learned early on why I couldn't get a prosecutor's job. A law professor finally told me, he said, well, they're not looking for people like you, Barnes. He thought I would be offended. I wasn't offended. I was like, okay. But it's because they don't want any Ed Snowdens. They don't want anybody that's self-reflective. The key to the journalism industry, to the political class, to all of it, is to have people who don't ask skeptical questions, don't question authority, and see their job as moral, righteous patrons of truth and justice here to deliver it to the people.
Right.
That's a much more powerful mechanism than thinking that you are Goebbels. I
agree. I remember watching Jimmy Dore talking about the media once. I think he was talking specifically about Brian Stelter, and he said, Stelter always says, I don't look at the advertisers. I don't look at where the money comes from. And it's true. That's how a lot of journalists are. But his point after that was, but that's exactly why you still have your job and you're still doing what you're doing, because you're not paying attention to that. And that maybe that would, for me anyway, like one of the main reasons that I left was because that excuse of that I had used many times before, like, oh, I just don't have the time. I don't have the resources. I'm doing the best I can. Like, I finally, it doesn't happen overnight, but over time, once you start waking up and you realize, well, wait a second, is that a good enough excuse to be pushing stories that are oversimplified and maybe incorrect? Like, no, that's not an excuse. So it's time to either change the job or quit. It either has the infrastructure of the job itself has to change, or you got to go. And everybody who gets that, I think, level of awareness probably leaves because you're not going to change the infrastructure at this point. It's the train's out of the gate, and so you're either, like you said, you're either going to kind of submit to the infrastructure rules, sorry, you just don't have the time. Sorry, this is what you have to do today. Sorry, you have 4 hours. Like, it's all constructed in this way that leaves you with what the product ends up being. And they absolutely could change it if they want to, right? If they wanted to give you 3 days to investigate something and you were encouraged to do so instead of shut down like me when you pitched, stories that were questioning, not even questioning, like the end of my ability to even pitch a vaccine story was like one time when in Washington, there was this legislative debate about what kids should be required to get in order to go to school. There were all these protests about it, and we were covering it. And there happened to be a group of doctors that came to town, and they were talking about, concerns over like the CDC schedule or whatever, or informed consent, whatever you call it. And I said, hey, maybe this would be an opportunity to cover this issue from outside of the just soccer moms screaming at each other, which is how we've been doing it in the past. And that was when I was told that I was not allowed to pitch stories about vaccines, and not even cover them. I wasn't even allowed to pitch them anymore. I wasn't even allowed to present the idea. And so, eventually, like, okay, if you're somebody who really cares about that stuff, you're not going to stay. You just aren't. Quick question. Can businesses, schools, or employers ask if you've been vaccinated? When is it considered a violation of HIPAA?
This is a confusion, and a lot of lawyers, because they're part of the professional class that loves vaccines, is out there preaching. And the Biden administration, of course, is saying people can do whatever they want. Those are not trustworthy sources, objective sources, in my view. They are sources that tells you where the courts may go, but by no means are they the final determinant of what the law actually is. But HIPAA only limits what your employer can tell other people. It doesn't limit what your employer can ask of you. The ADA does that. The Americans with Disabilities Act limits what your employer can inquire into. Where HIPAA applies is in public accommodations. Now, HIPAA does limit how they can disseminate the information within an employment context or by an employer to a third party, but not the employer-employee part. That's where ADA steps into the gap. But HIPAA does apply if I'm bringing a suit for a grocery store demanding certain information that they weren't entitled to ask about masks and the like, about what medical. And it's amazing to me how many of the so-called social justice left is totally okay with now anybody asking about your private medical information. And so I've been trying to push back on it with some of my friends saying, okay, next time you go to a grocery store, what happens if the clerk comes up and says, tell me about your therapy? Tell me what you're getting therapeutic treatment for. Tell me about your last discussion in your marital disagreement. Tell me, have you ever got treatment for maybe sex addiction or drug addiction? Would that be okay? Because if that's not okay, where do we draw the line? It used to be you don't get to ask, period, unless there's a business necessity, and that should still be the standard.
I was gonna say the joke that I have now, and this is not a question of a reflection of whether or not I've been vaccinated. Someone asks, I ask if they have herpes. Just like, have you been vaccinated? I don't know. Do you have
Exactly.
herpes? And especially the what's the word I'm looking for? The cognitive dissonance, where in California you decriminalize knowingly exposing someone to HIV while at the same time wanting to criminalize COVID and criminalize not being vaccinated and attach these conditions to this gesture, which by and large, we're talking about risks that are in the millions of risk of likelihood of you not being vaccinated, getting someone who has been vaccinated ill, and them actually getting sick and dying. But this is a classic one, Alison. Robert, we've talked about this, but nuts. The level of where the judiciary is going in Canada, out of Vancouver, out of British Columbia. A judge said, while admonishing someone for not having respected COVID guidelines and thrown like a basement party, she said, as far as I'm concerned, if someone was at that party and went and got Granny sick and Granny died, you'd be guilty of manslaughter. I mean, that's the
Wow.
next level causation that the judiciary, or at least some activists on the judiciary, are taking it to. But
that's a good example. I'm going to use a variation of that. I'm going to say, what if we had required people with HIV and AIDS to go around wearing a little ribbon that said they had it? People would have been outraged on the left.
Oh, yeah.
Fauci used to tell people you could get AIDS in your kitchen. I mean, that's the kind of idiocy this guy has a long history of propagating. And yet we're supposed to hold him up as some sort of expert.
I'm nervous to even mention this because it will take us down a whole other rabbit hole, but I'm pretty sure in some way he was connected to research over in Wuhan. Is that?
What happened was it became all of this. It's gain of function research. And there's no reason for biosafety defense because biological weapons research, Nixon was supposed to shut down in the 70s. Most countries are governed by treaties, not supposed to do it anymore. So all of their biological weapons research is called biosafety research. Purported, but why do you need gain of function for biosafety research?
What's
you
a
don't
gain
need
of
to make
function,
a
Robert?
virus more dangerous. They said, because somebody else might make it, and so we want a vaccine for it in advance. That doesn't make any sense. Someone else is making the same thing you're experimenting on. So it's entirely bioweapons. Fauci's been a big supporter of bioweapons. Many of the people defending, attacking the conspiracy theory of Wuhan lab being the source of it were connected to bioweapons industry. And I mean, that's why the reason why Alex Jones was ahead of the curve is he just has Francis Boyle on, who's been the primary critic. He was helped to design the laws to limit this back in the late 80s and has followed it ever since. But the bioweapons became controversial under Obama. It was banned by Congress, and Fauci circumvented it by funding Wuhan instead. So Fauci's neck deep in all this.
I'm definitely going to get this video ripped at this point. There's no hope. Okay. I want to get to this funny ending because I'm curious what you guys are going to think about this latest thing that came out about the government and pushing the vaccinations. But for those people who are facing jail time for businesses, so separate from the places of worship, but like you own a business, you're a restaurant owner in Michigan, for instance, is one of the cases currently underway. Is that just going to be a state by state thing that it's just going to be worked out, I guess, depending what the state's rules were? And is that something that we had any precedent for before this, that like you could tell somebody they couldn't go to work or they couldn't keep their business going because it was just too dangerous? Is this the first time we've seen that in, I guess, modern history?
Well, on this scale, first time in world history. We've never responded to any pandemic like we responded to this one. So you had some places limited, capacity limitations put on during the Spanish flu in a few cities. And the Spanish flu was far more lethal than this has ever been. And our air filtration systems far worse. And our medical treatment far more limited than what we have now, but not to this scale. And so I think the Stickman decision was the right decision. The Third Circuit stayed it, but never ruled on it. They just sat on it. And that's what a lot of judges are judges that recognize that what's happening here is illegal are playing hide the ball. Like the judge just did that recently in Florida. Florida sued the CDC, said, look, their rules to limit cruise ships don't even make sense on their terms, that they aren't based and founded in science. And the judge recognized that was probably true. But what does the judge do? Says, hey, why don't you guys mediate it? In other words, don't make me expose the unconstitutionality of the course of conduct taking place here, which is what the Supreme Court initially did, only started stepping in for churches, a year into the process. And I think one of, the extraordinary thing is the length of time here. Now, nothing like this, even during the Spanish flu, we didn't have year-long closures of anything. This is extraordinary, unprecedented, unparalleled. But the courts have been deferential because they're part of the same professional class that thinks they know better than you, the common citizenry. probably watches, independent news rather than the credible, trustworthy news like CNN and MSNBC, people like this. I mean, they don't realize their idols have fallen. They don't realize that nobody believes the Pope anymore and the Protestant Revolution's already here. But the courts are even further behind than everyone else on that. So there isn't a constitutional basis for it. They should win, but it's going to be uphill because the courts are going to try to dodge it and evade it as long as possible. And then probably, though, when they have to rule, by that point, they'll probably take the rules away and make it all moot, and they'll play Pontius Pilate again. Judges love to play Pontius Pilate and not make a ruling.
So to your point about that sort of priestly ruling class, just reading some of the ways that these judges are talking to these people. So this is coming out of Michigan, this particular restaurant owner. And the judge says, we're in the midst of a pandemic. You have selfishly not followed orders. You've not followed them for your own financial gain and apparently for the publicity that comes with this. And I feel like I hear judges over and over again, and not just judges, but a lot of people are pointing their fingers, and it seems like there's not a whole lot of empathy for the person who's like, hey, it's my business. This is how I feed my family. Like, you're a judge. You got to keep your job. Nobody, you're going to get paid. You work for the government. Like, you never lost a paycheck. And like, where's the, like you said, where's the cost benefit analysis? Where's the empathy for the people who are, losing their employment and may, lose their business forever? I mean, it seems like maybe they're not selfishly doing this. Maybe it's actually because they have legitimate reasons, like they need to feed their family. I've just been disappointed, I think, by all of that. But I guess that's where we're at now. We have very little empathy for people that we see as, I guess, our adversary.
I think the judiciary has done severe damage to itself, its credibility, its integrity, because of the way it's deferred to this process and exposed their class bigotry and bias and prejudice, which is rampant. I mean, I've seen it a lot, but it's still striking. And their lack of understanding of the broader public opinion on this over the long haul. What I told people was, early on, you'll get pretty broad support for a lot of these rules. But as time goes on, that support will diminish. And the people who feel hurt and offended and were injured by it, they're going to remember it a lot longer than those people who think they are benefited from it. So long term, that they made a poor political play. But it's just the contemptuous arrogance of these people. And that's, I mean, I briefly clerked for a Native American tribe designing its first tribal court system to deal with non-tribal relationships. That's why they were recreating it. They still had the tribal elder system for everyone else. What was fascinating was one of the first big mistakes was wearing a robe and being elevated. Tribal members came in and they said, "What are you doing up there? You have no business up there. You have no business having some royal clothes on. You should be even with me in dealing with this matter." And I thought, wow, how fascinating that tribal members had this core, deep democratic sense that we've lost. Why are judges above us anyway? They shouldn't be elevated up there. It was a wonderful experience to go through. But yeah, the judges are arrogant, condescending, mediocre intellectuals who get to rule the rest of us. That's who they are. Except for the judges I'm in front of. They're all nice and good.
I got to read you this, Allison. And Robert, this is out of the injunction judgment from Nova Scotia. Just reading one paragraph, and it says, the respondents and those who would support them by attending the planned or other in-person public gatherings without following the public health recommendations and orders are uninformed or willfully blind to the scientific and medical evidence that supports those measures. Their plan to gather in person in large numbers without social distancing and without masks in contravention of the public health recommendations and orders shows a callous and shameful disregard for the health and safety of their fellow citizens. This is out of an order of the court. It's couldn't be more on point.
Confession through projection. Everything they accuse everyone else of is what these selfish, callous pricks are guilty of.
That makes sense. Okay. All right. So for on a lighter note or more depressing note, depending on your social status, the White House partners with dating apps to encourage COVID vaccinations. Have you heard about this?
I think that's useful because I want to know who not to date. Anybody that's proud of their vaccination, you can just X them off.
I have a journalist friend of mine who refuses to date anyone who doesn't get vaccinated. So of course this is something now that is actually happening. And apparently, this is how it starts out. Starting this week, the White House is hoping Americans swipe right for COVID vaccines, partnering with a series of prominent dating apps to offer incentives to customers who have been vaccinated against the coronavirus. And it's going to be vaccinated users on Tinder, Hinge, OkCupid, and a bunch of other ones will gain access to premium content like boosts, super likes, and super swipes with proof of vaccination, according to the White House.
And think
What
about
is
that, by the way.
happening?
People are going to be giving their private
Vika
medical
showing us here?
information to apps that have a long history of being hacked. I mean, it's extraordinary what they're conditioning people to accept and approve.
I was just showing the section from that judgment because I think someone said that can't be real from there. Robert,
Oh.
another good point.
I thought you were showing us your Tinder account, and I was going to think that was really
Tinder
weird because you're married.
I'm off the dating market, and thank goodness, because living through these times, I asked. I mean, I talked about this last Wednesday. You know, like living through these times, trying to date, trying to have a girlfriend, trying to have a normal childhood. It criminalizes normal human emotions, normal human behavior, which itself is going to have an impact down the line. But Robert, again, one step ahead of the curve. People are disclosing their confidential information to these dumb hacks as if they didn't learn anything or enough from Madison. What was that Madison leak? The one where the people went to meet other married couples and they had the leak. Nobody knows. Why do I know that? Oh, Ashley Madison. Sorry, Ashley Madison. The whole big leak.
Oh, yeah. The date. You mean she was like wasn't she a high profile? What do you call him? Matchmaker?
No, it was the website where you would go hook up with other married people, and so
okay. I remember. Yeah, but these are all like executives, right? These are usually like very rich people.
And people who got outed. Some of them committed suicide. Whatever. The idea that you would give this intimate information to an app, given the leakage that has occurred through apps, you have to have your head examined. But the people who are into that are not thinking one step ahead of their freaking nose. It's crazy.
Not to mention, like, what about the actual things that really have mattered in the past for dating someone? Like, where's the app for people who don't have syphilis or gonorrhea or herpes or all these other things? Like, if we're going to do this, like, shouldn't we be bringing up a total STD board? Like, shouldn't you be getting blood work for all the things that really probably will become problematic if you go to meet each other on Tinder?
I mean, maybe that's going to be the future. I mean, if they can get people conditioned to sacrifice privacy in exchange for access to whether it's apps, travel, whatever it is, they've set a dangerous precedent that for people to follow. Now, luckily, there's been enough pushback, much more pushback. The people who are skeptical of vaccines was like 2 to 3 to 5% max before this started. Now it's about a third or 40% of the country. It backfired on them in ways they did not anticipate.
My husband adds, by the way, I am not allowed to donate blood because of all the vaccines I have had from the military, which is curious, which I do find odd.
That's one of the great cases that says you can't force emergency use vaccines. They Rumsfeld tried to force it through in 2003. And the federal court in D.C. said, no, this is an experimental vaccine. You can't compel people to get it under both the Nuremberg Code and federal law. So that's one of the very good precedents that's out there. Of course, the media and the legal left, the lawyer class as a class is just ignoring and pretending it doesn't exist.
Okay, any last thoughts on the topic of COVID vaccine cards, requirements, all that stuff? Like, where do we see that going? And if people are talking about passports, is that a thing? Or is that just a fear-mongering talking point? That we'll go out on that note, because I forgot to talk about that earlier. And so sorry, everybody, if you were thinking that we were just going to end something happy with dating apps.
I don't see how this comes within federal jurisdiction. So it's got to be, if just having a card on you that says you got the COVID vaccine, I don't see how that violates any existing federal law. So if you gave it to a federal authority and you made a statement under penalty of perjury, then it could come under federal law. But to give folks an idea, they couldn't indict a federal judge who lied to 2 FBI agents in the middle of a grand jury investigation, according to the U.S. Supreme Court unanimously, United States v. Aguilar. And so how is it that, why federal jurisdiction is limited to things that are within their jurisdiction? Just having a fake COVID card is not necessarily within federal jurisdiction. So I think they're exaggerating people's exposure here to terrorize people. Vaccine passports are a risk, but we'll see what happens with them legally and otherwise. And my ultimate answer to all this is, what if I just say I identify as vaccinated? Aren't they interfering with my right of self-identification by claiming that I have to have some independent I don't have to have independent verification of what gender I am anymore. So why is it I have to have independent verification of how I identify?
For the greater good, Robert, like from that zombie movie with that comedian, I forget what it is, but for the greater good. I mean, what people and people are saying this, and they're not thinking about the fact that maybe the greater good is in fact not compelling people to do this under these particular set of circumstances. Maybe the greater good is highlighting certain fundamental individual rights, because in the long grand scheme of things, respecting certain fundamental rights and liberties without creating exceptions that are themselves not particularly exceptional, that might be the actual greater good than the alternative, which we've seen materialize time and time again in the past when individual rights are not respected.
Yeah, this is about enforcing the Nuremberg Code of 1947. We said never again, and now people are thinking about, maybe we should go back to never again.
All right, I really appreciate you guys. As somebody said in my comment section once, I identify as vaccinated, and that should be enough. So in today's world, why doesn't that work? Thanks again for the live stream. Everybody, don't forget to go over to vivabarneslaw.locals.com or AlisonMorrow.locals.com. Also, there are other links in the description, but we'll cross our fingers that this live stream stays up. I did purposely demonetize it because I actually think I was quite successful in anti-authoritarianism April when I demonetized my channel. Because I don't know if YouTube's I actually got more views and more subscribers, thanks to people like yourselves for having me on your channels though. I did better when I demonetized, and I don't know if that's because YouTube has a greater spotlight on you when they run ads, but I don't know if I was just flying, because I did way more controversial videos that never got ripped compared to the one yesterday that got taken down, which was monetized. So I purposely demonetized this today just because I would like you guys to live in perpetuity on YouTube as long as possible. But anyway, again, thank you so much. And I hope you guys will come back on the channel the next time there's something legally controversial, which I'm sure there will be one tomorrow.
For sure.
All right. Bye, everybody. Take care of yourselves.
Good
and
night.
good night.